Bydo? I barely know her. On Super NES Works Episode 8. For American kids in the late 80s, video games were synonymous with Nintendo. It wasn't a bias or console warrior thing. Nintendo simply owned 9/10 of the gaming market. Atari 2600 and 7800 and the Sega Master System existed, but hardly anyone owned them, and they occupied a tiny niche at retail. Among all my game-loving classmates, I only knew a single kid who owned something besides an NES. He loved his Master System, and he spent a lot of time trying to tell the rest of us why it was a whole lot better than our Nintendo systems. For the most part, his efforts fell flat. I mean, yes, it was nice to have a secret snail maze built into the console, but on the whole, I suspect I probably had more fun with Mega Man 2 than he did with Snail Maze. But that's not to say some Master System games didn't turn my head. Among the games he liked to show off, none seemed more impressive than R-Type, a sci-fi shooter that never made it to NES. Developer Irem had a strong presence on NES and a close relationship with Nintendo back in the day, and Nintendo distributed the arcade version of R-Type. So its absence on the most popular console of the 80s has always been a mystery. No, Nintendo console owners wouldn't have the opportunity to enjoy R-Type for themselves until 1991, when the original game hit Game Boy and Super R-Type made its way to Super NES. In effect, owners of both systems got the full run of the series to that point, seeing as Super R-Type turned out to be more or less just a fancied-up conversion of the arcade game R-Type 2. But what made R-Type so intriguing back in the day? At first glance, it looks to be a simpler, earthier take on the Gradius concept. A horizontal space shooter with a decent power-up scheme and the ability to boost your firepower with a satellite component that trails behind your ship. R-Type is less colorful than Gradius, and its pacing somehow manages to be even more methodical, with highly rigid play design that demands careful memorization rather than pure reflex. What it lacks in zippy speed and improvisational opportunities, though, R-Type makes up for with splashy set pieces and bold visuals. Even more so than other games of the era, R-Type takes its visual cues from a combination of sci-fi anime like Macross and the Alien films. Half the enemies look like Zentradi pods or Destroids from Robotech, while the other half probably should require royalty payments to the estate of Swiss artist H.R. Giger. That's especially true of the bosses, which often appear to have a repulsive biomechanical vibe and a decidedly erotic component to them. The first stage boss, for example, is pretty much the alien xenomorph with its limbs hacked off, tethered to some enormous mechanical system, with its own chestburster spawn emerging from its abdomen to fire back at the protagonist. Or consider the boss Gomander, an enormous, throbbing, heart-like organ that not only looks decidedly yonic in nature, it even involves an enormous, snake-like serpent that flies around penetrating its openings. I mean, geez, it's not even subtle. These unsettling grotesqueries stand in stark contrast to the sterile environments in which the bosses reside. And they really set R-Type apart from the more prosaic competition of its time. Body horror was all the rage in shooters of the era, see Contra, Abidox, or even Gradius spin-off Life Force, but outside of Splatterhouse, it was pretty hard to find a game as aggressively revolting as R-Type. But this being an Irem creation, R-Type offered game design chops to back up its visual style. R-Type marries its frequently nauseating art and rigid combat to some incredible set pieces that give the games a more deliberate feel than their contemporaries. You're not simply streaking through enemy landscapes, you're invading heavily defended fortresses full of traps and obstacles, such as the indestructible rings you need to maneuver through. Sometimes you're even dismantling the enemy's most powerful weapons piece by piece. For example, R-Type has an entire stage that takes place not in space per usual, but rather takes the form of a flyby against a Star Destroyer-sized warship whose core you need to destroy while blasting apart the ship's point defenses. It's a brilliant concept for a scenario, taking the concept of a boss and expanding it to fill an entire stage. But most of all, what set R-Type apart from its peers was the addition of the Force Bit. Again, at first glance, the Force Bit makes R-Type look a lot like Gradius, coming off as nothing so much as a ripoff of the Option power-up. The Force Bit takes the form of a small module that your ship can collect at the end of the first stage, adding strength to your firepower. It can orbit freely around your ship, like Options in the later Gradius sequels, but that's only the beginning. The Force module is indestructible, and you can use it not only for additional firepower, but also as a shield. Attach the bit to your ship, any part of your ship, and you suddenly have a nearly impenetrable barrier capable of blocking projectiles and destroying enemies. Not only that, but you can even use the bit itself as a projectile. Fire the force module into a bad guy and you'll inflict major damage, and the little guy will continue to mirror your shots and block enemy attacks as it drifts back toward your R9 fighter. The force bit's presence and the need to master its use define R-Type and set it apart from the competition. The game even inspired a handful of clones, such as the infamous Zero Wing. Unfortunately, the original R-Type cast a long shadow, which is why this episode of Super NES Works spends more time on the first game than on this reworking of the sequel. The reality is that much as with Gradius III, Super R-Type doesn't really offer a lot of incredible new ideas to the mix. Again, with the Gradius comparison, Super R-Type initially feels a lot like Gradius III, especially the way the opening stage begins with a few simple lines of ships in open space before you reach land masses and fight more dynamic and varied formations. You'll notice some immediate differences, like the fact that the power-up bar in the status display simply indicates the strength of your charged shot, and that alternate weapons drop as standalone icons rather than using Gradius III's upgrade bar. And Super R-Type does have a few distinct and interesting moments throughout, like the huge armored Stage 2 boss, which now rips off the Guyver rather than Macross, and the minefield midway through Stage 1, which reappears at the game's end. And the final boss presents a fun high-concept scenario. The boss has tethered a ton of R9 fighters, presumably the ones you've lost through the many deaths you experience en route to the end of the game, to use against you. But you can free them and let them join you as you fight back against the Bydo Empire's ruler. Once the final boss is defeated, you all make a mad dash for the exit, and your liberated comrades help you blast through the fortress wall to escape into space. For the most part though, Super R-Type feels like a lot more of the same, but without the moments of surprising genius that made the first game so memorable. The biggest addition here is that delightful first-gen Super NES slowdown we've seen in Gradius III and Final Fight. While it's not as bad here as in those other titles, it only goes to feed the notion that the console couldn't handle fast action as well as the TurboGrafx-16 or Genesis. At the same time, Super R-Type does take away something vitally important: any sense of mercy or clemency. The game has become somewhat infamous among shooter fans for including one of the most hateful design choices imaginable. Irem removed mid-stage checkpoints. R-Type was a crazy hard shooter to begin with, and Irem designed R-Type 2, which serves as the basis for this home port, as a sort of experts mode for those who had mastered the original. So take a hard game, make it harder, then force players to complete every stage without a single mistake, and you have one of the most punishing games on this or any system. I have no doubt Irem made this tweak to balance out the extreme brevity of the game. A perfect playthrough of Super R-Type takes less than half an hour to complete, which seems incredibly meager compared to the likes of Super Mario World and its battery-backed 96-exit stage map. Rentals were a huge point of contention back in the early 90s, since US courts came down on the side of consumers and backed up the right to rent. Publishers took pains to adjust the difficulty level of American releases upward to prevent their games from being completed on a single rental. And certainly that strategy worked here. There's no way you're going to finish Super R-Type on your first attempt. At first I thought my difficulties with the game here were simply my old man reflexes at work. But I played this game back in the day, eager to finally have a chance to enjoy R-Type on a Nintendo system, and I found myself immediately vexed. This was back when I could complete Battletoads without warping, and Life Force on a single life, and even then, Super R-Type humbled me. And I'm not alone. The general consensus about this game is that it's brutally, even unfairly difficult. But hey, for those who want a genuine challenge and don't mind being spanked hard for the slightest mistake, Super R-Type is a nice looking shooter with a pretty great core mechanic. And if you can somehow finish the game on hard mode, you can play the second loop on what one assumes is a humanly impossible pro difficulty level. Still, Super R-Type feels like something of a letdown here in the Super NES pantheon. It lacks the spark of imagination that ignited the original game in the series, and the horrible punishing sensation it creates sucks much of the joy away from the experience. It might actually be even more soul-crushing than the chopper stages and Pilot Wings. Irem would eventually give players a more impressive take on R-Type with a Super NES exclusive R-Type 3, but that wouldn't hit until 1993. At this point in the system's life, Super R-Type sits somewhat unconvincingly between Gradius III and HAL's overlooked Hyperzone. And in fact, we'll be looking at Hyperzone next episode, so look forward to it.